Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar for schools, which is an overview of Cyber Essentials. So this is the first of several webinars. So we're going to be learning as we go with this one. You can hopefully see all the slides here, and you can post in the questions and answers tab if you've got any questions, and we'll aim to answer those as we go along. So I'm Emma Philpott. I'm the CEO of IASME. So we are the Government Cyber Essentials partner, and we are helping to provide the Cyber Essentials for the schools. I would like to introduce now Peter Looms. So Peter is going to be giving the webinar. He has more than 20 years experience in cybersecurity. He's been a school governor for many years, I think. He has worked in many places, including for the government, and he's been involved in the Cyber Essentials scheme right from the start of the scheme. So that's for at least 6 years. He also runs the training course for all our Cyber Essentials assessors. So he knows a lot about Cyber Essentials. So without further ado, I will pass over to Peter.
Hello, I presume I'm live, so thanks, Emma. Well, that was a bit of an introduction. I was gonna say they normally say this is the first, but they're going to normally say the best till last. But actually, no, you've got the best first because I'm doing it. So anyway, welcome to Cyber Essentials for Schools. What I'm going to cover this afternoon we'll look at the threats that are faced by schools, and we'll look at why those threats are increasing. And what Cyber Essentials is aimed to do, and specifically also what it's not aimed to do. And I'm not going to be using any technical language. I will introduce you to the technical terms, but I'll give you the English meanings of those. How Cyber Essentials reduces the common threats, and how we know that it reduces those common threats. It's a bit of an interesting science is cybersecurity. How do we know really that we're reducing these things? Because it doesn't happen to everybody every day, does it? And then how to get certified. At the end of this session, I hope you're going to be in a position, if not to be able to prepare your school, then be able to talk to advisors and assessors and understand what they're telling you about your environment. When I say prepare your school, I mean obviously it depends on the size of your organisation. The school I was a governor of, still have the scars from, was a primary school, and we relied an awful lot on the governors and the PTA to help out in things like this. Some of that was good, some of that was bad, and I'll pick some of that out as we go through as well. And also to understand that Cyber Essentials is actually not an expensive option. It's actually quite a low cost option, and it's a very robust option as well. So let's first look at the threats. What is really happening out there, and what things are you as schools potentially exposed to? Well, hopefully you're not exposed to nation state, and Cyber Essentials was never designed to combat nation state attacks. The Chinese army are thought to have an awful lot of people out there doing cyber, do we call it cyber warfare or cyber attacks? And if you look, they're so good they don't even need keyboards. So if they come after you, you're best just throwing your hands up probably. And also, we've seen reported instances of Russian influence in elections and things like that. We're certainly not talking about things like that. What we are talking about, though, potentially, are these other 4 groups. We tend to split up in the cybersecurity world. We tend to split our threat actors up into these 5 groups of activists, hackers, insiders, the state-sponsored, and then the criminals, all with their own motivations. So activists, an agenda or ideology. I haven't got my afternoon teeth in, obviously, and they'll be championing the cause. And schools could quite easily be open to this. I mean, last year there was the issue in Birmingham of sex education in schools. Activists could easily have jumped on that and started to attack these schools. We then have the hackers. Generally, these are the ones that we're looking at are using simple to use tools. We've then got insiders, malicious, or more commonly accidental, and then the high level criminals. They're the ones that are going out after money. Now, the interesting point in all of these is that they'll all start at the lowest point. They'll all use the simplest tools first. So the tools that the hacker groups that we've used there, that I've said the simple tools, then all of these groups will use those simple tools first. They don't want to get their toys out of the toy cupboard unless they absolutely have to, because once the tools have been used, they have a very short shelf life. Well, we hope they have a very short shelf life. Some have longer shelf lives than others. Now, in schools in particular, the hacker groups and the insiders can be a part of your wider population. They can be within your pupil population. Now, that's not always that they're there to do bad things. Pupils, like everybody else, make mistakes. Given a memory stick by someone to carry their homework backwards and forwards from home to school, and that's got malware on it, or their device at home has malware on it and gets transferred to the memory stick and brought into school. It could be because they're being naughty. When I was at school, we just wrote rude messages on the revolving chalkboard, so when the teacher pulled it down, a rude message came, and then we'd all put our hands up when they asked who did that. But it's got a bit more sophisticated than that now. They might try to bring down the school network. Or again, more commonly, I would say, they're experimenting and not realizing what they're doing wrong. So we can class those as either hackers or insiders. And what we need to do is start to protect against their common modes of attack. What are the common modes of attack that we looked at when setting up Cyber Essentials were the very, very simple things. And in fact, these still make up over 90% of the common routes of attack today. We looked at social engineering. By that, we meant sending emails. You'll have heard of things called phishing emails, sending emails, lots and lots of emails out to lots and lots of people, links in them, which either take you to a website that's going to steal personal data, a website that contains malicious code, or there's an attachment in them that also contains that malicious code. And it's still a fact today that 90% of cyber attacks start with an email. We've then got exploiting vulnerabilities. And these are known vulnerabilities. So every month, looking at the common platform, every month Microsoft put out their patches on Patch Tuesday. The hacking community look at those patches and then know what vulnerabilities are in older versions of the software from what's been updated. And they will then exploit those vulnerabilities. using very simple off-the-shelf tools. And then the third area was really around password guessing. So whether that be shoulder surfing somebody, working out their password from information that we may have about them, probably taken from social engineering, or using tools to guess passwords, known as brute forcing passwords. And we're going to look at an example in a moment where password guessing was actually used. And how real is this for schools? Well, I did just a little search when I was preparing this presentation a couple of weeks ago, and could have filled off a dozen slides with web pages, but I just pulled the top few off. You can see when I pulled it Tuesday, March the 2nd, when I was pulling this together. And then just last week, there was a large attack that was reported on a group of secondary schools in Leicestershire, and that was so large that actually the National Cybersecurity Centre got involved in that, and that's actually where I saw the report from. It popped up on the National Cybersecurity Centre's news feed. So I say that was large enough for the NCSC to get involved. Now, the question that we always have to ask around this is, are these attacks targeted, or are the organisations casualties of something else that happens? The likelihood is that they're actually casualties, because probably 80% of cyber attacks are opportunist attacks. Now, for those attacks to happen, there has to be some weakness in the system to allow the opportunists to get lucky. Now, 20% being the target attacks may not be fully accurate, but I would work around that sort of 80-20 split around the targeted versus the non-targeted attack. So whilst these are of lower sophistication, there's more people out there performing them, and there's potentially then a higher risk of you getting caught by them if you're not doing the basics. And why is it increasing? I did a bit of research about 18 months ago, and I was looking into why cybercrime is increasing so much. You know, what was this trend? And I found this equation, and now this is from a bloke who got a grade 5 CSE in maths when I was at school. So grade 5 CSE maths is not something to shout about. But now I'm a bloke who loves an equation, and finding this, I thought this is brilliant. But then when I looked into it, it told me so much about why cybercrime's increasing and why we need to keep on the ball and keep this thing going. And it's very simple. This piece of research said people commit crimes for two reasons: monetary benefit, psychological benefit. Now, if that outweighs the cost of committing the crime and any costs of any penalties they may get, times the chances of being caught, and then the chances of being convicted at the end of that, the crime's worth committing. So what does that mean? Let's look at two crimes. I get fed. Let's put me in the equation. I get fed up of doing Cyber Essentials talks and training Cyber Essentials assessors, and think there's got to be a better way to make a living. So I decide that I'm going to go out and rob a bank. Now, there's quite a lot of effort I've got to put into robbing a bank. I've got to do a lot of recceing. I may need to get myself some tools to do it. I may decide that I'm going to be armed to do it, so I've got to get that. So there's probably money involved as well. My chances of being caught are quite high, in fact, very high. And if I get convicted, I'm looking at a minimum of 5 years. And the money and psychological benefit, money's not life-changing. If I walk out of a bank with £20,000, that would probably be the most I'd walk out of a bank with these days if I actually got out. Let's spin that round and look at cybercrime. The chances of getting caught are very low. The chances of getting convicted are very low. The cost of committing the crime is very low. The sentences, if you get caught, quite low, depends where you are in the world. And that's a problem with getting convicted, because the crime may happen in the UK, but may have actually started somewhere with very different and more lax laws than we have. But the return rate is very, very high. Just this month, the National Cybersecurity Centre reported on a ransomware attack, the most common form of attack at the moment, that cost the organisation $6.5 million to get the ransom key back. They were also a little bit silly because they didn't then close the door that was open, and 2 weeks later they got hit by the same one and had to pay another $6.5 million to get the key back again. And the Twitter attack that happened at the back end of last year, where it was send me $1,000 and I'll send you $2,000 in Bitcoin back, that netted £85,000 in 30 minutes, which is the more attractive of the crimes to commit these days. There's one cyber criminal out there who, although anonymous, did an interview. So because they were anonymous, we have to question whether or not this is a legitimate person, but they're reputed to be worth now over $1 billion from ransomware attacks alone. He was asked why he wouldn't quit, because he's made $1 billion, and he said, as well as enjoying it, his other comment was, no amount of money is ever enough money. So that's the level of mentality that we're dealing with in this area. So let's look at a case study, and then what I'm going to do is follow this case study through Cyber Essentials as we look at the Cyber Essentials controls. So this case happened, I got this case from an insurance company, and it happened during the Easter holidays a couple of years ago. It was a ransomware attack, so the data of the school that the school held was all encrypted. However, it was unclear if the criminals had taken the data as well. And that's a common thing in a ransomware attack, is they will say, well, we've actually got your data, so if you don't pay us, we'll release the data anyway. The data that was lost included that of the children that were currently at the school and the children that had been joining in the autumn term. And at that point, they were planning familiarization days. And of course, they lost all the information on the children that they were going to be offering familiarization days to. And it caused a lot of disruption. On investigation, it was shown that weak access controls on a remote desktop, so a desktop that allowed access from outside of the organization, usually for support. It was weak passwords, weak security on that, was where the attacker had first got in. There was also weaknesses found in their virus scanning tool, the utility tool, and the criminal managed to gain access to an administrator account and release ransomware on the environment. The attacker then demanded 2 Bitcoin for the key. Current value of that is around £71,000. We don't know whether data was actually breached, whether data actually went, and therefore there did have to be a report to the Information Commissioner on this. And they also had to bring in an incident response organisation to help them recover their systems, and that cost them an extra £17,000. plus it took several weeks. They were into the summer holidays before the systems were actually fully recovered and they were working again. So what could they have done to have actually stopped that or reduced the impact of it? And potentially, how would Cyber Essentials have worked? Well, it's certainly not about turning your information systems into those that would support Fort Knox. It's about putting the locks in the right places. The analogy that we used, that I used a few years ago, I went on holiday to Canada and we went walking in the woods, and I was concerned about bears. I went and bought bear bell and pepper spray, and the amusing guy in the shop said, "Remember, you don't have to outrun the bear. You have to outrun the person next to you." And that's equivalent around Cyber Essentials. You don't have to have necessarily the strength of Fort Knox. You have to make it more difficult for the criminal to get in such that they move on. They're going to take a quick look. Most of this is opportunist. It's the equivalent to trying car door handles walking down the street. So let's look where Cyber Essentials comes in then. And there are 5 things that Cyber Essentials says you should do in order to strengthen your environments. And that's put some controls at your boundaries, so some walls up to prevent the wrong people getting in. You need to secure the configuration of your devices, and that sounds harder than it actually is. You need to make sure that only the right people, once they're in your environment, can actually get into your systems. You need to stop malware, and you need to make sure that you're on the latest version of software. So let's go through each of those and see what they mean. So we talk about firewalls. That first one was about firewalls, and firewalls tend to be contained in these things called routers, and I'm going to explain both of those in a minute. What's a firewall do? If we remember old Victorian terraces, their roof spaces were all open. If a fire happened in one terrace, it would go up across the roof and burn all the other terraces. Building regulations were then put in to say that a firewall must be built up to roof level to hold back this fire, stop the spread. It's exactly what a firewall's there to do. It's there to stop the spread of any malicious or untoward communications into your network. Now, it works obviously slightly different to the physical type firewall, and basically there are rules within it that say if you meet these requirements or these criteria, your information is allowed through the firewall. If not, you're not allowed through the firewall. And all the devices that you have these firewalls on them. So your PC that you're probably watching this on will have a firewall on it. A router, a home router, a professional type router, or an office type router will have firewalls on. And so will bigger computer servers. They'll have firewalls on as well. But they need to be configured to ensure that they're meeting the minimum requirements. And those requirements are quite simple. So there are some communications, older style communications methods that are now identified as high risk. And these communication methods go through ports. So making sure that none of those high risk communication ports are open on the firewall. Now, generally, I'll say that firewalls do tend to come with them closed, but it's worth checking. And there is a list of, there's a document called Requirements for IT Infrastructure by the NCSC that lists the high risk communication ports that shouldn't be open on your firewall. Not allow access to any traffic that's not initiated from inside the organization. And that, if anything, is probably the strongest one to implement. So if I've not sent a message to computer B, but computer B sends a message to us and says, I want to come into your organization, you go, no, because we've not asked for that communication. And these firewalls and routers and these bits of kit all have what's known as an administration interface for obviously managing them, and that should never be accessible from the internet. So very simple things. Now, as I've just said, if you've got a router, you've got a firewall. If you've got a PC, you've got a firewall. These things just need configuring. No additional purchases necessary. Securing the configuration of your devices. Out of the box, this is changing, I will say, but out of the box generally, computers and IT equipment are configured towards features. People used to buy, but increasingly are not, but used to buy based upon features. You'd go and you'd have a look, you'd walk into Curry's PC World, and the young lad or young lass that was selling would point out all the features that the machine had. Never would they mention security. They'd mention all the free versions of software that it came with. And some of those can be a problem. So we go through a process of what we call strengthening devices. Now, I spent ages posing for that photograph, and then I noticed that there's a little blemish on my shoulder there that I should have photoshopped out, but I'll learn for next time. So we want to strengthen our devices. So what does that mean? Well, when we get new devices, they'll come with probably admin accounts, guest accounts, call them what you will, and then you'll set up an account for yourself to log in. Well, what we need to do is get rid of those accounts that are not required, because they'll sit and be unmonitored. And sometimes they come with default passwords that are known by the criminals, and then they'll be exploited. And particularly if it's an admin account, that can be used for really nefarious tasks. And this also applies to mobile phones, tablets, routers, switches, all sorts of things on your network that come with these accounts. I've just put mesh networking into my house, and I bought 3 high-end, quite expensive wireless access points to put the mesh in, and all of them came with the default admin password of admin, with the default password of admin. And every cyber criminal in the world knows that if I'd not changed those, they'd be able to get in and change my settings and then take over my network, potentially. So default passwords, I've really just touched on default passwords. A lot of devices come default password of admin, username of admin, password of admin. We need to change those. We need to change them to something that's quite strong. I also personally opt to change my usernames, the admin account usernames, away from straight admin, because they're the sort of things that are searched for anyway. So changing the passwords on all the devices that are within your organization. Software. When we get a new device, and with apologies for the mock-up of the Windows 10 here, I couldn't work out any other way of doing it. I spent ages trying to mock up a Windows 10 screen, but anyway, you press programs, and then you'll find there's everything under the sun and all these trial applications and widgets that you think, oh, that's really useful, I'll use that. And then after 2 weeks, you stop using it because it's taking you longer to use it than before when you used to write it down on a sheet of paper. So what you should do is set these devices such that literally just the software that you're going to use every day or regularly is on those devices. The reason being is all those that you don't use sit and fester away, fall out of date, and actually become a vulnerability on your device. And I'll explain more about how these vulnerabilities are discovered when we get into patching or software updating. And then generally the final thing around strengthening your devices is autoplay, turning autoplay off. So autoplay is the thing where when you plug in a USB stick, if there's an executable file on the USB stick, or if you've still got a CD-ROM or a DVD, it spun up the DVD and it would run whatever was on there, as it will run anything that's on the USB stick. If that's malicious, it's too late, you've run it. So if you turn autoplay off, it will stop you running those things automatically. Again, I don't think I've talked about anything yet that's an additional cost to the organization apart from a little bit of time. And how would this have helped in the scenario that I gave earlier? So it was suspected, but not proven, that the administrator account that was used was possibly a generic account. They're not sure about that, but there was generic accounts still on there. So removing that account would have helped. Setting appropriate passwords on the other accounts would also have helped. And a firewall configured correctly may have also helped reject any malicious traffic. So there's two things. So now let's look at the third element of Cyber Essentials, which is user access control, ensuring that only legitimate people can have access to your environment. Let's look at an analogy then of some shared accommodation. So here we have some shared accommodation where it's managed and people rent a room and potentially some of the other luxuries within the organization, like the sauna, or within the environment like the sauna. It's managed, so we need somebody who's going to do the site maintenance. And that would be the equivalent of our administrator in our computer system. And the site maintenance person has access to every door because they've got to be able to get in to be able to sort out any issues or potentially even clean. We have a tenant who in our case would be a user. And in this case, our tenant has access to the front door, can get access to the communal areas, so the communal loo, the living room, the kitchen, and their bedroom, and the bathroom, but they can't get admitted to the sauna because they're not paying for that. So if I got hold of the tenant's key, I can get into just their room and get the ill-gotten gains from just their room. If I get the site maintenance manager's key, I can get everywhere and I can steal or do damage to every part of the organization. So which is the most attractive for me to get? Obviously, it's the site administrator's key. But there are also possibilities if I manage to get hold of the tenant's key that I can increase the access of that key and turn it into the site maintenance manager's key. So we need to protect all access equally. So we need to make sure that user accounts, people only have access to what they need. So based on what they need to do for their daily job. The administrator accounts should be limited to as few people as possible, making the risk of if we lose one of those accounts or the there's less chance, sorry, of those accounts being attacked. Those special administrator accounts should only ever be used for administration work, and never when the person who has one is connected to the internet, because that would allow me to try and steal it. All users should have to log on to your environment before they can see any data. And when somebody leaves the organization, the account should immediately be disabled or deleted. And you should review the accounts on a regular basis as well to make sure that people who have moved jobs only have access to the things that they need. Each account should be unique for each user with its own unique password. Passwords should be long. It should be 3 random words is the current recommendation, or a phrase. 3 random words because 3 random words are easy for people to remember, or a phrase is easier for people to remember. They can be composed of upper and lowercase letters and special characters to make them a little bit longer. And no upper limit on password lengths is also recommended. If you can use biometrics like fingerprint, facial recognition, that's okay. And it's also a good idea to lock accounts on so many failed attempts. Brute force attacks tend to use dictionaries. They'll throw lots of words and commonly known passwords at accounts. If the account locks after, say, 5 failed attempts, the software that they're using is likely to reset, start again, or they'll get fed up and move on elsewhere because they know they've only got 5 attempts to get a password. Multi-factor authentication is also something that is highly recommended. This is generally around something you know, which is a password or a PIN code, or something you have, which may be a certificate on a device that allows that device to access, or a one-time passcode, or potentially a biometric as well. And there's a couple of examples of one-time passcode generators there. One is Google Authenticator. So there's 4 different services down there, and for each service, every minute the passcode changes, and you type in the relevant passcode at the time, or you can get a text message to your phone. Now, Microsoft in a report recently said that actually these will prevent 90% of unauthorized password use. Because if you've got the password, you put the password in, and then it's going to ask for this second factor authentication. And they're very complicated algorithms, these. So the chances of finding the right number is billions to 1, I would suspect. So how would this have helped in the case study? So admin account passwords would have been stronger, and it would have taken longer to crack those passwords if that's in fact what they did. Logouts would have slowed down or stopped the attempt at password guessing. And multi-factor authentication would have potentially rendered any passwords that they had useless. Now, both of these multi-factor devices, if they're supported, so the one on the text one is actually Microsoft Office 365, and that authenticator, Google Authenticator, is a number of different accounts. Both of those 2-factor authentication options are free. They just need configuring in your relative systems. Then we come on to malware protection. So we hear a lot about viruses, Trojans, botnets. What are all these things? Well, generally we group them together and call them malware. And you'll hear the term viruses used a lot because IT pinches language from other, well, from the wider world and other professions. Some of it we can actually spell right, but we got phishing wrong. And viruses are called viruses because of the way they move around, or malware, the way it moves around. So it's made up of two parts. It needs a transport mechanism. So in the virus world, that's a cough. Currently, it's a persistent cough. And then in that cough, or that sneeze, is the payload, which is all that nasty stuff that's coming out there that contains viruses. And we know to try and protect ourselves against this, and more than ever do we know about protecting ourselves against these things. Very simple measures. We've had the hands, face, space message from UK government, and we talk about similar things as far as, you know, very simple methods as far as protecting ourselves against internet-based malware, stroke viruses, call them what we will. There's generally three ways. Antivirus applications that sit on your devices. You may restrict your you may restrict down your use of software to, that should say, allow listing. Apologies. And then a more complex approach called sandboxing. And I'll go through each of them fairly quickly. When we get the sign of potentially getting a virus, we get that tickly bit in the back of our throats. We'll reach for the first defense. Other products are available, but we'll reach for something like that and hopefully stave it off. Or at the moment, we're trying to prevent that spread, and we're wearing masks. Again, very simple methods. In the computer world, we use products called antivirus applications or anti-malware applications, and there are loads of these around. And this is just a representative sample. If you're a Windows organization, then Windows Defender is a reasonable option to. It's a good option to use, reasonable option to use in your environments. And is highly recognized these days, so no potential cost there. When you've got anti-malware, it needs to be installed on all of your computers. You need to keep the program up to date and the files by which it identifies potentially harmful applications. And you need to do that daily as well. You need to configure it to scan files automatically when the file's opened. So when I double click on a file, my antivirus does a very quick scan on it. You don't even notice it happening these days. Very quick scan, and then allows it to open. If it finds that it's a problem, it will shut that file down. You should schedule it to run daily deep scans. Mine runs one at 12:30 every day because that's when I go for lunch. And it should also check that you're when you're accessing websites that they're not potentially malicious as well. I usually get the question, blimey, updating daily, isn't that a little bit excessive? No, because I did some work for an anti-malware supplier, and this is a few years ago now. So this is potentially quite out of date. And at that point, they were seeing 868,000 new virus versions a day. That's not completely new. It's probably the same virus, but carrying, or same transport mechanism, but carrying slightly different payload. So it's a big problem. There's then the allow listing, so restricting applications to those that are only approved by the organization and allowing nothing else to run on the device at all. And that's called allow listing. Now, if you're using iOS devices and potentially Android phones. So Apple phones, Apple tablets, you will be using allow listing anyway, because you're only allowed to download software from the Apple Store. And if you're running Android devices that are restricted purely to the Google Play Store, you're doing allow listing on them as well. Now, Android phones, you can also install anti-malware onto, but there isn't really any antivirus known for iOS. There are some vulnerability scanning devices, but not anti-malware. And then finally, whitelisting. Sandboxing. Sandboxing is a little bit more complex, and generally probably would not be used in schools, because it has to be managed and maintained a little more than the others. They'll just run themselves. So how would that have helped in our case study? Well, the ransomware would only have taken hold if the anti-malware allowed it or didn't reject it. And the anti-malware didn't reject it. It didn't identify that ransomware as a potentious malicious file. Now, I'm not saying anti-malware in itself will stop a ransomware attack. We're looking at a multi-level of or multiple levels of protection here, but it certainly would have helped. And then on to the final one, which is around updating software, and probably the most crucial. You have to make sure that all the operating systems in your environment are supported, and the software is all supported, and it's all licensed. And this is about simply making sure that the kit you're running is on the latest and most up-to-date version of any platform, any technical kit, any software. So this means no dodgy versions of software that a kind parents copied for you and said, "Oh, it's okay. This is fine to use," and no versions of software that are old and are no longer receiving updates. Now, this is where I appreciate there may be a cost to the school, but a few £100 for a new version of software is better than a ransomware attack. And just to put that into some more context, let's look at why it's important. Now, it's fairly recognized in the industry, in the IT industry, that for every 1,000 lines of code, there's roughly about 10 to 15 errors. Now, a lot of the major software manufacturers, and I'll include Microsoft and Apple, and amongst these, have worked hard to get this error level as far as they can. But software is complex these days, and there is still a reasonable number of errors. Now, some of these are never going to see the light of day. There'll never be an occasion where that error manifests itself. Some can introduce vulnerabilities into the system, and those vulnerabilities are the things that can be used by criminals. Generally, they don't get known about. There are some that go out looking for these vulnerabilities. Let's look at a standard PC configuration then. Windows 10 has roughly, as far as I can find out, these are estimations because obviously Microsoft don't publish this, but this is from looking at insider forums and things like that, around 50 million lines of code. Office 365 has roughly 75 million lines of code. Now, as this is a school event, I presume you've all done the calculation very, very quickly and worked out that actually that equates to around about 12.5 million errors just in that configuration itself, and that's not counting things like the firmware on devices and other software that may be on as well. So potentially there's 12.5 million errors. Now, occasionally they'll manifest that they'll pop up to the top and they'll be discovered as a vulnerability within the system. And this is when organizations say, like Microsoft do their Patch Tuesday. and they'll update their applications and they'll update critical security issues. And they'll give that version of the software a new version number. Now, because they've done that, the criminals now know. Let's say Patch Tuesday brings out version 2021-2. Now the cyber criminals know that 2021-1, the previous version, and all versions before that have the vulnerabilities in them that have been fixed. So they will then scan for those versions of software on the internet. So you're all saying, well, this software's on my machine, right? So it doesn't matter. Nobody's going to know what's on my machine. So let's look at the tale of two computers then. Patch Tuesday resolves a critical security issue known as Cybot 7. And this is the latest version. It's been updated. When it accesses the internet, the device broadcasts details about what version of the operating system it's running, all sorts of information, lots of information, what browser, what version of the browser it's running, all sorts of things. If you've updated the software, then the cyber criminals are blind to that piece of software, that environment. Their scanning tools will just go straight past it. However, look at the one that's not been patched. That's not going to be affected, and it's going to be on the old version number. That'll connect to the internet exactly the same way, but the cyber criminals can see that, and bingo, they've got access. They've got a machine that they can exploit the vulnerability on. And this takes, we have to think about this as well across all of our devices, firewalls, printers, laptop, tablets, mobile phones, routers, anything that has software or what's known as firmware in it, which is the software that tells them how to operate, that they're updated. And this software should be fixed within 14 days. And the rationale for that 14 days was because when we established Cyber Essentials, from a vulnerability becoming known, it was roughly about that time that the criminals took to develop an exploit. The latest incident involving Microsoft Exchange, just a couple of weeks ago, from that vulnerability becoming known, it was actually 8 days for the ransomware to be developed. You're okay using open source operating systems and software, so the things that tend to be free but supported, if there is a support network. So if you're using things like LibreOffice and Ubuntu and products like that. So how would this have out? Well, for that ransomware to run, there would need to be a vulnerability in the system. And it's likely that that vulnerability would have been fixed in the latest update of the software. So it's unlikely that the attacker would have been able to have exploited that weakness. So how do we know that Cyber Essentials works? Well, one, it's supported by the National Cybersecurity Centre, the UK's go-to place for cybersecurity information and advice, and they are monitoring the threats to the UK all the time. Secondly, in 2014, there was an independent piece of research by the University of Lancaster. The University of Lancaster basically set up two networks, one network without Cyber Essentials, one network with Cyber Essentials. And then they fired lots of common attacks at those networks. The one with Cyber Essential fully mitigated just over 69% of those attacks, which meant that the attacks had no effect on the environment at all, and 30% were partially mitigated, which meant there was some disruption, but it didn't take the system out of operation, and only 0.7% were not mitigated. So it's a reasonable thing to do, right? So how do organizations get certified? Well, you need to implement the requirements, and you can do those yourself, as you've seen today. They are relatively straightforward, relatively simple. You can get help from a consultant. Hopefully now you know the questions to ask of the consultant and the things to instruct them to do. And you can get help from one of the Cyber Essentials certification bodies. There are 2 levels of certification, and it's up to you to decide which one you want to go for. Both of them look at exactly the same things. One is slightly stricter. There's the Cyber Essentials self-assessed, where the organisation completes a self-assessment questionnaire and an assessor marks that, and they're not. That's the only contact that they will potentially have with the assessor. And then there's the Cyber Essentials Plus, which is an audited assessment of, in effect, the self-assessment questionnaire. So you fill in the self-assessment questionnaire, an auditor comes out and checks that question, what you actually said in the questionnaire is true and is accurate, and also runs a vulnerability scan on your environment. And for Cyber Essentials self-assessed, there is a maximum charge for the assessment of £300 plus VAT, but I can't give you a cost for the Cyber Essentials Plus because it depends upon the complexity of your organisation and how long the assessor would be running the vulnerability scan. Excuse me, running the vulnerability scan and doing the audit. But you also need to plan to recertify every year. So this is not a one-stop assessment. It's something that should be done every year. It's just like having your car MOT'd. The assessor will come in every year, or you will do your assessment every year and just check that you've got everything still running correctly. There's also other information out there. There are guides from IASME. There's IASME guidance for schools. And this is on the IASME website, which the links are down there. And I'll be on the next 3 slides anyway. There is the IASME Cyber Essentials Readiness Assessment, and there's a specific one of those for schools as well. There's also some stuff from the National Cybersecurity Centre. There's questions for school governing bodies. There are information cards that can be given out to members of staff around cybersecurity issues. And there's also some guidance on secure home learning as well. And they're available from ncsc.gov.uk. That's a little bit more about us. IASME, we are the partner for delivering Cyber Essentials for the NCSC. And we also run another scheme called the IASME Governance Certification, which looks, so Cyber Essentials looks at just the technical controls. IASME looks at more of the information assurance, the technical, the process, and the people elements of securing your data. And then recently we've just introduced a new certification for products around the Internet of Things. So look for that certification on Internet of Things products. And that's it from me. Thank you very much. And I'll hand back to Emma.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Peter. I'm just going to share a final slide because I've realized that
Do you want me to
after
stop sharing
telling
my
you,
screen then?
Yes, please. After telling you that it was going to be possible to ask questions as you went along, it turned out not to be. So I'm really sorry about that. There on the slide that I have just put up, you can see info@iasme.co.uk. If you have any questions at all about Peter's presentation, please email us there, or right at the bottom you can see that there's a phone number there, so you can give us a ring, and we've got lots of cheerful people waiting to take your calls. And the thing about that is if they don't know the answer, they'll just be able to feed your question through to the technical team. Also, you can see there a very, very long link. Now I'm going to email this to you, so don't feel that you have to write it down. This is a link to feedback to find out how you have found this first webinar. Hopefully you found it useful. All the webinars are going to be available to access via our website a couple of days after their broadcast. So in a couple of days, you'll be able to go onto the guidance page of our website, and you'll be able to click, and you'll be able to view this same webinar by it's like YouTube, but it's called Vimeo, and it just means that you don't have to put up with all the adverts. So hopefully you'll be able to ask your questions through that route, and I will send you an email with that link for the feedback. So thank you very, very much. Thank you to Peter for giving us that overview. We have some more webinars coming up. There's one tomorrow on how to decide the scope when you do the assessment of your school. And then we have one webinar for each of the 5 controls coming up. And there's also a final webinar about the insurance that's included in the scheme. So those are coming up on days in the future. You can book them on Eventbrite. You should have been sent links from the Department for Education. And if you have any problems at all, just ring us or email us on that email address there. Just one final point. Peter was talking about the 2 levels of assurance for Cyber Essentials. So if you are listening, if you're one of the RPA pilot schools, it's the verified self-assessment, the lower level, that is included in that pilot scheme. So have an absolutely lovely rest of your day. Do contact us with any questions, and thank you again for your attention. Thank you very much. Bye.